Well, I'm really glad to have followed Josh on this because I really do believe that even though we are in two very distinct regions of the state, we do have a lot of concerns. And I'm glad that we have an opportunity as extension specialists to really talk about specific challenges across the state because there's so many principles and practices that we learn in the classroom. And when they are applied across large areas, it becomes a lot more challenging. And it's not just the soils and the agronomic production, but the mechanics. And Josh spoke about equipment, and that's something that we address in the high plains too. Planter mechanics and equipment mechanics and just how we're getting these crops established becomes a very important consideration that we often do not consider when we're promoting different practices. In the Panhandle, I've offered a couple of planter clinics specifically to talk about how we manage equipment in our no-till systems, repairing equipment, all the extra costs, trash whippers, and how we manage different just seed to soil contact issues, whether it's in no-till or even on our dry land acres where we have these soils. So a lot of really good information from Josh that translates into this region too. And so I know Calvin Trussell spoke yesterday, and I'm excited to be able to talk about just the differences in the high plains. And so let's see what slides are sharing. So when we talk about the Texas High Plains, of course, the Texas High Plains is part of the United States Great Plains. And depending on the literature and what we're looking at, it's also called the Southern Great Plains. And that becomes very confusing for many people in Texas because there's the Southern High Plains and the Northern High Plains, but we're specifically talking about Texas now. And so, of course, this High Plains region. And even though the High Plains, when we start talking about our extension geographies and our area of reach, does extend often into what we would consider to be the West Texas rolling plains off of this Caprock escarpment. Really, when we talk about the intensive crop production in the Texas Northern High Plains, it's going to be up on top of this very vast plateau. And what's very unique about this is that we see a very strong incline in elevation, which really does impact crop production. When we get to this northwest corner of the Texas High Plains, we're looking at close to 4,400 feet elevation, which is ideal for corn production in the summer. We have very low relative humidity, so 10 to 15% relative humidity and 65-degree mornings. So when we are in that tasseling period, it is a really cool, ideal morning. And as long as we have the water, we can really do well. As we move to the southeast, our elevation does drop. And when we get southeast of Amarillo, we're down 2,000 feet or less. And so as we just look at the environmental interactions, we see, of course, that we have an increasing in relative humidity as we go east. Increase in precipitation, all the above. So again, the northern Texas High Plains is what really encompasses the Texas Panhandle portion of this Texas High Plains region. So when we consider this region, even though we are focused on row crop production, I do think it's very important to point out that more than 50% of the region is in native pasture lands. And when we look at the distinction between our croplands, we have a large portion of our croplands that are dry land or rain fed. And so about 9% of this area is actually in irrigated crop production, which would be intensively managed. And because of our water, this 9% piece of the pie continues to decline every year. When we talk about, of course, these environmental variations, I think it's really important to put it in perspective with regards to that crop water demand. And Josh spoke about that with regards to timing of crop water, critical stages in cotton. It's really interesting when we look at this across the United States. There's a point at the 98th meridian where the precipitation is less than the potential evapotranspiration. And of course, when we look at that, we see that as we move farther west, that becomes greater. And of course, when I talk about that precipitation as we move even just across the Texas panhandle, on our eastern boundary, we on average have about 24 inches of rainfall. When we get to our western portion of the Texas panhandle, on average, we're looking at about 16 inches of rainfall per year. So very distinct differences in those precipitation gradients. And when I mentioned that 98th meridian, which is the point where the precipitation actually transitions to being either greater or less than the crop water demand, of course, the annual precipitation. And when we think about annual precipitation, it's important to remember that that does not always coincide with the period of greatest water demand with the plant or the crops that we are growing. And so as we look at managing irrigation, that's why we see those increased yields with irrigation. But moving west, what's really interesting as we look at this and move to this 100th meridian, this is would be what is often determined or called Powell's 100th meridian. And when the U.S. West was being explored, in 1878, when Powell was coming through and doing his expeditions, he hit the 100th meridian. And at that time, he said there would not be viable crop production west of the 100th meridian without irrigation. When I visit with people, they're often surprised to hear, oh my gosh, irrigation, 1878. But what we have to understand is that Europe already had established canal systems during that period. Even in parts of California, they were creating canal systems during that period. So people were already very familiar with irrigation and the value of irrigation to enhance yields. And of course, that goes back thousands of years as we look at just agricultural history. But they understood that because of the weather, that would be very challenging. Now, what really benefited this region would have been just the advances in center pivot, not center, sorry, let me back up. The advances in pumping and centrifugal pumps and the ability to irrigate. So when we talk about, though, the environmental factor, that really does limit plant growth in the northern high plains. In water limited environments, we have to give more consideration to limitations in plant available water. And of course, with this, it's the irrigation, the precipitation, and the stored soil water. And so as I consider this, I do think it's important that as the climate smart ambassadors are considering cropping system limitations and decisions producers have to make, they really do have to be cognizant of these plant water relations and challenges across the state and understand why in some areas it's more challenging to establish cover crops, just like Josh said, or why we have these distinct variations in yield, or even why producers do determine to or decide to make certain cropping practices. Slides are advancing. So as I talk about irrigation in the Texas Panhandle is over the Ogallala Aquifer, and this is the largest unconfined aquifer in the United States. It actually underlies 8 states. And what's really distinct about the Ogallala is that the saturated thickness of the Ogallala Aquifer decreases as we move south from South Dakota to Nebraska, which has the largest area of saturated thickness under it, down through Kansas and into the Texas Panhandle. And what we have seen over the last 60 years is a very rapid decline in the saturated thickness of that aquifer. Now, the southern reaches of the aquifer are under the southern high plains in that Lubbock region. And then, of course, in this northern region, we have still some pockets of very strong water. But what is unique about these areas that still have very strong saturated thickness is that the topography of that region does not necessarily permit row crop production. And so we have strong water there because we have not been able to intensively farm that area like we have other areas. And so as we move forward, what we're seeing is a very rapid change in cropping systems. And that is because even though we still have some water in these areas, many of these areas barely have enough water for their houses or even livestock water. They no longer have enough irrigation capacity for irrigation. And so we're at a point where there's a very distinct transition in cropping systems across the high plains. As I mentioned, as we saw the development and the adoption of the centrifugal pump, we really saw irrigation take off very rapidly in the Texas high plains. And what we have seen actually since the 1970s is a decline in the irrigated acres, and that's simply because we have known since that point that we're seeing a decline in the saturated thickness, and especially in the southern high plains. Now, there's this little bump right here in the 1990s, and that was actually a rise in irrigated acres because of the center pivot system. The center pivot has allowed producers to become more efficient with their irrigation applications, and as producers became more efficient, they would then irrigate 2 to 3 times the number of acres, hence the rise in irrigated acres. But that increase in irrigated acreage came at the expense of conservation. And, as we look at that allowed the aquifer to decline at an even greater rate. And so even though this figure stops at 2007, we're probably close to down here around a little over 2.5 million irrigated acres today. And when I mentioned those being irrigated acres, those would not be acres that are irrigated at 100% of the crop ET or crop water demand. Most of those acres are now irrigated at a deficit rate. So as we discuss this, and as climate smart ambassadors are working with producers to consider different production practices, I do think it's really important that they do keep in mind that there's a very big concern amongst producers about the Texas high plains and how long this aquifer is going to last. And so as we look at practices, many producers are considering converting many of their irrigated acres to perennial forages, and with the understanding that they may no longer have enough irrigation capacity to irrigate a row crop, but they definitely do have enough water to get a perennial forage established and enough to supplement it during periods of drought. So looking at the high plains, though, and when we talk about row crop production, I think it's very important for people to understand that we are producing feed grains and forages. I often hear students who come in and talk about the Great Plains being the breadbasket of the world. And when we get up into Kansas and other areas, that is true. And we are in many ways at the southern tip of that because we do grow quite a bit of wheat. But even much of our wheat goes in as a feed grain and is used by the hog industry, and even depending on wheat prices will be used by our beef cattle. So we have a very large livestock industry. When we look at just the portion of that livestock industry as a fraction of the state, especially our concentrated animal feeding operations, these fed beef numbers, those are feedlots. And then, of course, the hogs and the dairy. And these numbers, again, are several years old. And the dairy production is probably over 60% of the state now, just because of the very large dairies that are in this region. And as I mentioned, we're talking about feed grains. The majority of our crops are all going to be corn, wheat, cotton, sorghum, as well as silage, which is going to be those annual forages that are ensiled, and hay production. We do have some alternative crops, a little bit of canola. There's a few producers who grow melons, and most of the grapes are on the South Plains, but there's a few pockets here and there. But the majority would be these primary row crops. And even today, this corn fraction has declined quite a bit. When we look at the soils in this region, they are deep soils. They are wind-blown deposits from the Rocky Mountains during the Pleistocene period. And most of our soils are going to be mollisols, clay loam soils, very deep, well-drained soils. When we get into portions of the western panhandle, we actually do have some pockets of sandier soil. These would be alpha sols, more of a loamy, sandy loam soils, also those aeolian or wind-blown deposits. Of course, as producers talk about managing soils for carbon, and I know that's a large part of this project, as I think back to just the history of soils, at one time after the Dust Bowl, there was soil conservation, and then we've gone through periods where we had soil quality, and now we talk about soil health. But we're really all talking about the same concept. We want to make sure that we are minimizing erosion and ensuring the production potential of our soils. But often we don't consider how our native soils vary. And I do think that as climate smart ambassadors work with soils across the state, they have a good understanding of the intrinsic differences of all these different soil types in Texas. As we move west, we have soils that are naturally lower in organic matter. The native range soils in the Texas Panhandle are probably closer to a 2.5% organic matter soil. And of course, when we talk about that, that is because, we have limited water. As I mentioned, we get to the western Texas Panhandle, average rainfall is 16 inches, 18 inches in some years. And so with the reduction in biomass production, there's a reduction in organic matter that goes into the soil. And of course, that reduces the long-term carbon pools and the potential for that. And then, of course, our crop production as a whole is going to be limited by the low precipitation that we receive, but also just the very high evaporative demands. This portion of the Texas Panhandle, our potential ET or evaporative demand is about 95 inches per year. So going back to that PET being greater than our average rainfall, it's a very windy environment. It's not uncommon for most days to be 20-mile-an-hour winds, very low relative humidity, as I mentioned, 10 to 15%, which does help, when you have hot summer days, at least it's not humid, so it can still be very pleasant. Looking at the acres and the concentration of acres in the Texas Panhandle in comparison to the U.S. as well as other parts of the state, with cotton, we've recently seen cotton expand more into this region from the cotton belt of the Texas South Plains. And of course, Texas remains, that #1 cotton state. So we really do see quite a bit of cotton production across the whole state. Winter wheat, we have very large pockets of winter wheat production in the Texas High Plains. And I'll speak about these in a little more depth if time permits. Also sorghum production, that's a very important crop in this region, especially with regards to dry land production. Increasingly, we're seeing more sorghum silage, and that is simply because of the lack of water and the fact that producers no longer have the irrigation capacity to produce as much corn silage as is needed. And with that, we also have seen the small grain silages really take off. Now with corn acres, what we have seen in recent years is a very large decline in corn for grain acres in the Texas High Plains. And many producers who are still growing corn are opting to chop it for silage. So talking about cotton production, and especially it's always interesting when I see this cotton production region of Texas map. And I routinely point out, hey, we do grow cotton north of Amarillo, but this region north of Amarillo has still yet to make it on our cotton production map. And so as climate smart ambassadors, keep in mind that there is cotton production north of Amarillo. As I mentioned, though, this has been a relatively new a cotton production region. It was really started in 2015. And what we saw about that time was, as producers were trying to determine how to best manage those limited well capacities, cotton became a crop that just fit very well in these systems. And as we look at that period of peak water demand in cotton, that usually is going to come after our peak water demand in corn. So if producers are sharing irrigation systems with corn, there's the ability to shift that water around and use it strategically and optimize production for both crops. Also, cotton, of course, is just that heat tolerant and drought tolerant crop that does well. But it's not just the fact that cotton is adapted to this region. We now have newer varieties that are early medium maturing varieties that perform very well in this region without a reduction in fiber quality. And that's really important. What we have seen, of course, there's a few dips in production. 2021, there was a dip. Actually, that was, I believe, in response to some just commodity prices. The last couple of years, there's been some dips because of just weather events. In 2022, we had a lot of cotton that was planted and it was hailed out or flooded out because we actually had some very heavy rains for about a 6-week period that came through at that time. And because of that, though, that actually limits replant options for cotton in this region. And so producers have to then make other cropping decisions, whether it's leaving that field fallow for the summer, replanting to wheat in the fall, or possibly going in with a late corn or a sorghum crop. But nevertheless, we are still seeing in this region, with Amarillo being just right here and Interstate 40 coming through the Panhandle right about this area right here where this line is as well, that there's still about 500,000 cotton acres there. So when we talk about Texas having 6.5 million cotton acres, 500,000 of cotton acres in this region is not significant. But what I do like to point out is when we compare the Texas High Plains to other cotton production states, this little region of Texas is still pretty competitive with regards to cotton production in other regions. And so this number right here actually encompasses not just the High Plains, but steps down into our Extension District D1. And so, of course, Extension is divided up into different districts across the state, but there's a lot of production in this lower tier of counties. And so I am a district agronomist, D1 agronomist, and that does encompass that whole area here, which is now why we're looking at about 1 million acres, taking into account that lower tier of counties. And when you look at all of these other states that we consider to be cotton states, the Texas High Plains does compete very well with those other states. So it is nationally an important cotton region, even though it's a very small piece of our Texas cotton region or Texas cotton production. So with that, I do quite a bit of work in cotton in the Panhandle, our variety trials, as well as look at some other work. As I mentioned earlier, when we talk about plant-water relations, it's important to keep in mind that we can control irrigation timing in agronomics, but we can't control the environment. So with that, producers are making these very hard decisions. For time, I'm going to rush through a lot of these slides very quickly. We're seeing a very big shift in our forage production. As I mentioned, a lot of sorghum silage going in place of corn silage. This is my trial out at Bushland, corn silage that's very water stressed, right next to some sorghum silage. Really, the corn silage introduces quite a bit of production risk to a system. We see this is actually looking at several years of corn silage yields, the grain to the tonnage potential. And what we really see is that most of the producers are down in this lower yielding potential, and that they just really do not have the capacity to make the corn silage that they once hoped. We do quite in my program. We do quite a bit of forage sorghum research, specifically targeting the dairy and the beef cattle industries in this region. But as we talk about silage, and of course, looking at these climate smart programs, residue management and soil management becomes a very important concern. This is a picture that I took north of Amarillo on January the 25th. And I thought it was so distinct, two side by side fields. And you wouldn't think that these fields are literally adjoining, but they are. And to the left, we have a field that was in corn, and there's standing residue. And what was very distinct about this is that there was a blizzard that came through this area on January the 8th. And so about 2 weeks later, there was still standing snow in this field because that residue is going to capture that snow and hold that, and then also help protect that soil and serve as a blanket and minimize the evaporative losses. So this field was actually still very muddy. There was a lot of good moisture in this field. Now the field to the right, no standing residue, and I intentionally got down low so that you could see the scarring on the soil surface from the wind erosion. And so as we look at crop production and even these changing cropping systems and moving to silage systems, residue management becomes something that we're losing after years and years of really strong systems, simply because of the silage demand. This was another picture that I took north of Amarillo just a couple of years ago. We were actually harvesting some wheat silage plots when a dust storm came in. And this would have been what would have been the heart of the Dust Bowl area just south of Dalhart, Texas. And this area was very quick to adopt conservation tillage and residue management. So even though there's not as much cover cropping in this area as there is in more humid regions of the state or even of the U.S., residue management has really been a very important production practice. But again, as we move to more and more silage, we're losing that residue, and we're winding up with some pretty intensive dust storms, even in the northern panhandle, an area that where this has not been the norm. Wheat's a very important commodity, as I mentioned, in this region. Do a lot of variety trials, do quite a bit of work with small grain silages. Wheat silage is called wheatlage, if anyone hears that term. Now, even though we have wheat silage or wheatlage, there's different stages. We also have what is called green chop, or wheat that's harvested at the boot stage, to do some work looking at the different stages. So as we talk about forage, though, we're really seeing this shifting in our cropping systems, and that's because we have less water. As water declines, we have less grain production, we have more forage production, we also have more cotton. So when we talk about more forages and more cotton, we are seeing a shift in the economic cash flow with our secondary ag industries, but we're also seeing a shift in soils. And so, cotton is a low residue crop. Silage is a low residue crop once it's removed. And so, this is impacting our soils, but it's also important that, all this really goes back to plant water relations, and just a big cycle here. Let's see. Cover crop work, I do just want to mention that. Done some cover crop, and there are producers who are interested. But one of our greatest challenges with cover crops in this region is, especially in these silage systems, we have a lot of truck traffic. And when we're talking about, it's not just choppers or tillage implement, or not just choppers coming through the field. These big manure tankers actually cause very significant compaction. And this is one of the reasons why we do see some pretty intensive tillage on these forage systems, because even with our cover crops, we see that below the surface soil, this is actually doing some penetrometer measurements in one of our cover crop treatments. Of course, lots of variability in penetrometer measurements, but really below the top 12 to 15 centimeters, we don't see a change. And even at that, the changes are not significantly different. yield differences. So the question does come back when we talk about cover crops. At some point, is it better just to manage our residues and not grow cover crops because of our water limitations, especially if we do have a little irrigation, but that's even more challenging in dry land. In a dry land system, we often don't have the water to establish our primary crop, let alone a cover crop. So fallow periods are really key. Different rotations in fallow systems. One of the things that I'm going to just mention very briefly, when I worked for the USDA as a research technician, I was part of a long-term project actually looking at some historical fields at the USDA ARS research farm that were implemented and converted to different tillage projects after the Dust Bowl. So probably the longest established field research plots in the Texas High Plains. And what we saw there was that in these dry land systems, the soil organic carbon declined 41% in that 86-year window. 50% of that loss was before the conservation tillage, of course, was implemented. And after conservation tillage was implemented, we actually did not see an increase in soil organic carbon. But what we did see is that we stabilized any further degradation. And that's really very important. When we start talking about these practices, it's important that producers understand and are not discouraged by not building up organic carbon or building up soil organic matter or material. We really want to see stabilization in our very water limited systems, and that's good. And so that is something to keep in mind as we look at these systems. Soil moisture, this is just looking at long-term changes in soil moisture. This is before 1972, before conservation tillage was implemented. This is after 1972 and after conservation tillage was implemented. We saw this increase in soil moisture. But Josh made a really good point with regards to tillage. Not all tillage is the same. And it's important that we understand that not all tillage is bad either. In very water limited systems, oftentimes going through with a sweet till, such as what would be considered to be like this, or even a strip till system, we can help break up some weeds. We can help roughen up the surface so it doesn't blow, but we don't necessarily disturb those subsoil layers. And I was part of a research project where we actually did evaluate that. And this is coming in and looking at the impact of tillage to 4 inches. And what we saw is a change in soil water content in that surface, actually to the 4-inch level. But once we were below 4 inches, we actually did not have any soil moisture loss. Now, of course, we're talking about our seed zone, and if we are planting, we have just lost our planting moisture. But when we're talking about breaking up the subsoil and breaking up where our carbon is and our soil organic matter, we have not done that. So it is important that as ambassadors, we work with producers and that they understand that. And of course, why is this possible? That's because there's different evaporation phases in the soil. And when we look at these very shallow soil tillage events, what we're doing is actually disrupting the capillary flow. And so the soil moisture in these lower depths are no longer able to be lost through fluxes, and we don't lose that moisture. So because of that, I'm not going to go through anything else. I am actually 4 minutes over time. I apologize. But looking at these practices, there's a few things I've highlighted that I think really would be good practices for this region. Definitely a lot of opportunities in CAFO management. And then, of course, looking at some of our row crop strategies. So with that, if anyone has any questions, you can reach out to me. I know there's not time for any, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this region.